Welcome, everybody. My name is Edwige Simon, and I'm the director of the Graduate Certificate Program. We are, excuse me, we're a small program of Colorado Boulder. The certificate is a 12 credit program that are offered fully online. We're not quite a master's program, we're actually just a credential, but the credits that you earn through the certificate can be transferred to a master's program. Most students who enroll in the certificate enroll in maybe one course, two courses, and then they decide whether they want to continue with the certificate. You don't have to declare your intention to pursue the certificate. You can decide at the end. As a matter of fact, once you have completed the 12 graduate credits and including the 2 requirements, you receive the certificate. You offering this spring. So these are the 3 courses that we will be offering this spring. The certificate program is very flexible. You can start at any time. You can take the courses in any order, and there are no prerequisites. And basically, to start taking courses, you enroll as a CU student. You have instructions here on how to enroll and register, and you start taking courses. If you've been looking at the program for a while, you'll notice that our courses just got a little shorter. And so starting this spring, the 2 credit hour courses will be 7 weeks, and our 1 credit hour course will be 5 weeks. And in summer, our 3 credit hour courses will be 9 weeks. So that's a small change that we're making. Registration for the spring courses will open November 4th, and I'm going to give a webinar on the spring courses in December. But just briefly to go over the courses, the first course that we'll offer, and I will be teaching all 3 courses to just get that out of the way. So if you have any questions about the content, you can email me. The first course that I will be teaching is a course called Emerging Tools in Practice. And it's a 7-week course. And it's a course that is dedicated to emerging technologies for language learning. And so it's very exploratory. It's very participatory. Every student in the class is going to pick an emerging tool to explore over the course of 7 weeks. And I'm restructuring the course a little bit so that in addition to exploring a tool, I'm going to propose to the group that we collaboratively write a small report on emerging tools for language learning, what they are, where they are, what they do, who uses them for what. And so in addition to weekly readings on different topics such as augmented reality and virtual reality, each student in the class will be in charge of exploring an emerging technology. The next course that we will be offering is a course that is actually going to teacher proficiency. And it's one of my favorite courses in the program. It's a course where the teachers are paired one-on-one with a native speaker of the language that they teach over video conference. And they have 2 30-minute conversations per week for 5 weeks. The conversations are recorded. The students listen back to them and write reflection. And then there is a small discussion piece to this course as well. And so we read things such as how to maintain proficiency. This week we're doing a reading, because I'm teaching this course this week, I'm doing a reading on how your proficiency impacts your students' learning study. Really, it's a great course, and it's a really great way to boost your proficiency and your confidence as well. Our language partners are really nice. They're very sympathetic, they're experienced partners, and it's just a really great experience. And then the last course that I will be offering this spring is a course on digital games and language learning, where we will be exploring ways to use digital games for second language acquisition. So it's a 7-week course. We'll be looking at different topics, different apps, different strategies. We'll be reading the research. There is a small final project where the students will brainstorm a possible language learning games, and there are small deliverables throughout the course. So these are the spring courses. If you're interested, if you have questions, just email me and we can schedule a phone call and we can talk about the program, or maybe plan on attending the December webinar. So let me introduce Eve Leons, who is Associate Professor at Landmark College. Eve is going to talk to us about teaching world languages to students with learning differences.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Today, I'll be presenting this webinar on teaching world languages to students with learning differences. I've been teaching at Landmark College for 23 years. Landmark is unique in that it specializes in providing high-quality educational experiences to students who learn differently, which means that most of my students have documented learning disabilities. During this webinar, we're going to be looking at common difficulties that students with learning differences face, specifically in world language classes. And of course, we want to identify some effective teaching principles and strategies. Here's my typical class. My students may have one or more of the following. If I were to look in their educational testing, I see all of this: dyslexia, language-based learning differences, ADHD, ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, phonological processing issues, auditory processing issues. I won't read you the whole list, but you can see I have a wide variety of learning differences that I'm working with every day. Learning disabilities, unlike physical disabilities, are hidden. So they can potentially also be hidden to your student. They may not actually know that they have a problem until they take your language class. Often students have developed compensatory skills. So a student, let's just say when they were 6 or 7 or 8 and learning how to read, and they were put in that special class for students who needed support with phonological processing, for example. Those students still have those weak language skills, but they had received appropriate instruction. And so they've been able to succeed in other classes up until the time when they hit your language class. Or you may have a student who does in fact know that they have a diagnosis of a learning difference, but they don't necessarily want to let you know or their classmates know because they want to fit in and look normal. Which is why it's important to do all the things that we do as caring teachers. Build relationships with students, remain open and curious, ask questions, lower anxiety, and of course, focus on strengths and cushion areas of weakness. And this presentation will be a lot about, well, how do you cushion those areas of weakness? So we'll look at some of these common difficulties. One of the things that tends to pop up right away is difficulty decoding multisyllabic words. Anaranjado in Spanish, which means orange, is a very common one to bump into. So it's a 5-syllable word. And the learning burden of this word for a student with language processing issues is the equivalent of learning 5 words for someone who has intact, strong language processing skills. Students will have difficulty retrieving even learned language. Certain words are easier to retrieve than others. Concrete words, for example, cookie or kitty, are easier to retrieve than something slightly more abstract, and oddly personal pronouns fall into this category, like he, she, we, they, and you can tell pretty quickly why that would be problematic. Listening activities can be tricky because it's the auditory without the benefit of the support of the written word underneath. Students are likely to also have difficulty parsing the speech stream, which is why people say, oh, why does everyone speak so quickly in that language? And part of that is because they're having difficulty parsing the speech stream. They can't tell where one word stops and the other starts. My example here was, please tell me if you need a break, which will sound like one word often to students who are having difficulty figuring out the word breaks. It's common for students to have difficulty understanding grammar explanations, and this is both in the first language and the target language. It's common for students, especially with language-based learning differences, to really not have a concrete understanding of what a noun, a verb, and an adjective is, much less indirect and direct objects. Textbook activities tend to be especially problematic, and we'll talk more about those in a bit, but these are, what I mean is the classic textbook activities like fill in the blanks, multiple choice, activities that are almost more like puzzles. Students will also have difficulty holding all the pieces of language together. So all of the information they learned in their first semester course, gluing that to their second semester course and beyond. Often students will actually do pretty well in their first and second semester courses. And then once they hit intermediate mid, intermediate high thing, where the expectations are that they're at that level, that they'll start to fall apart and be unable to keep up with the work of the class. We'll also see considerable memory challenges. And again, this is specifically linked to the learning disability. Phonological short-term memory issues are related to language-based learning disabilities. Working memory is impacted by weak executive functioning. And then of course, simply anxiety, stress, and sleep issues also impact memory. And so this is both, in terms of your working memory and then just long-term memory and retrieval. Oral language disappears almost instantly, but if we're going to understand it, we have to receive it and process it before it fades. And that happens very quickly. So what do my classes look like on the surface? They look like regular classes. We're very active and try to make it a fun, welcoming environment. But underneath the surface of my classroom, to the best of my ability, I try to create what I think of as a Zen garden. Very peaceful, very structured, very predictable, and calm. I think of my classes as happening on a 24/7 time frame. So when I first started teaching, I was involved in a 3-year FIPSE study. And the study was specifically on what are best practices for working with students with learning differences in world language classrooms. And we identified 8 practices. And I'll try to, some of these overlap and you'll see that, but I'll go through each one. So the first is make careful curricular choices and be conscious of pace. Build in support for students with specific needs, such as language-based learning disabilities, ADHD, ASD. Use multimodal, multisensory teaching methods. Structure activities for success. Utilize instructional and assistive technologies. Actively employ learning and memory strategies. Build in one-on-one support if possible, and create a supportive in-class environment. All right, so we're gonna take a look at the first one, making careful curricular choices and be conscious of pace. All right, so I think of this as, when I think of what I would like to do in the course of a semester, I also have to think about, okay, what is absolutely critical for them to learn? And I think of this as sort of making maple syrup. And that's probably because I work in Vermont, where we make a lot of maple syrup. So because students with learning disabilities will take longer to master material, I need to boil down the curriculum and focus on practical, high-frequency language. And it's important to the best of my ability, give them time to really learn the material. So I really strive to teach for mastery and space review. So I'm constantly teaching something, reviewing, building it in again. Much of what I do is cumulative. You can imagine how students love that. All right, build in support for students with specific needs. All right, so your students with executive functioning issues are going to have a harder time managing materials. So luckily, I think hopefully we all have access to things like course websites and learning management systems now. These give us the ability to provide avenues for teacher-student contact easily through the course management system or separately through email, text. Students can easily figure out when their office hours are because hopefully it's listed on your course management system. It's easy to keep materials available online for students who missed class or are paying attention in class or simply want more practice. In terms of in-class materials, it's wonderful if things can be color-coded, hole-punched handouts, daily agendas, both on the course management website, also on the board, things like assignment checklists, and online grade books are fabulous because they both act as a reality check and as an assignment book. It's important to choose materials that have support both for auditory and visual information. So when you're working with information that's exclusively auditory, you're going to make it very difficult for some students to process that information. So I like to be able to give my students access to the written word in some way at the same time that they're listening to a given bit of information. So whether that's a written transcript that's available with a video, when I'm working with video, it's important to also pick a video that has closed captioning. I'm showing you the example on the left-hand side of Radio Ambulante, which is a podcast. And some of their podcasts, they just have in, you know, like a radio show, a regular podcast. And then some of their podcasts, they also have a transcript with that. Some of them, they also have little video clips that will go with that. So I try to pick materials that have the most number of support materials with them available. And the same thing goes the opposite way. When I'm working with written language, to the best of my ability, I need to figure out ways to also give students access to the sounds of the word, so to the audio also. When I'm working with written text, I want to figure out like how I can modify it easily. So for some students, just having something in a bigger font can make a world of difference. For some students, if I can take those words and create white space between those words, that's what's going to make a difference. And it varies from person to person. There isn't one answer. But the magic is, if as a teacher, I choose materials that are easy to modify on the fly, that's going to work best for both me and my students. This is an example of something I wouldn't pick. So let's just say I love this particular podcast. I would love to be able to use it. If it's only available to me in audio format and would take me an awful lot of work to get a text printout with this, I'm just going to skip it because it's not going to work for students. All right, so another example of things that tend not to work. This is a fairly typical kind of textbook assignment. So you can see it's a regular kind of a conversation, except for there's chunks of the conversation that are missing, and then the learner needs to choose. In this case, I think it's a drop down, so I would choose between various words. But it's a very unnatural language task. Like at no point do conversations look like this. So students with language differences tend to have an extremely hard time doing these activities, and they're very, very time consuming. So they can take that time, and it's better spent doing activities where they're being better supported and they get more bang for their buck in terms of the time that they're putting in for the learning that they're getting out. I like to look at homework specifically because I feel like as teachers, a lot of magic can happen in a classroom because we're so good at reading a student's needs and being able to modify on the spot. Homework tends to be an area of a problem for students because they're less supported, and teachers tend to rely more on materials that are provided by textbook companies. And certainly not always, but that is at times the case. So I guess one thing I would caution is avoid paper workbooks because students can spend an awful lot of time doing them and not getting any feedback in the moment. So they can spend half an hour doing something, being confused, doing it incorrectly, and then that's just wasted practice. There's also online homework that comes with, gorgeous online textbooks. But though you have to look really carefully at how that homework is set up. So for example, I'm tutoring one student right now and he's doing his homework. This particular teacher has the assignment set up so that the student has two practices. You don't get the feedback until you've completed all of the different questions in that section. And then once you hit the button saying you submit, it'll tell you what you got wrong, but it won't tell you what you got wrong specifically. It'll tell you the line you got wrong, but it won't give you a hint as to what the problem was. And it could be something as simple as a misspelling, it could be a missing accent, or it could just be you're just not doing this right. So really good feedback makes a huge amounts of difference, and otherwise just you're getting some fairly anxious students on your hands that aren't learning nearly as much as you hope. All right, which leads us pretty naturally into structure activities for success. So again, looking at those common areas of difficulty, you have your phonological processing issues, your auditory processing issues, slow processing speed, memory, etc. And so some of the things you want to do, if you take a look at the right-hand column, is break down tasks into manageable chunks, teach multimodally, provide clear structure, think about ways to support language retrieval, and plan on needing to modify materials based on student feedback. So in some ways, I think of this as, giving students an enormous chocolate cake, because they absolutely, and that's of course your exciting curriculum, because students absolutely want to be engaged with that and learn. But they may not be able to if you give them too big a chunk of this cake or the entire cake. They just can't manage. And of course, what that chunk looks like is different for each student, and that's where it gets complicated. So each student might need something different. So as a teacher, if you choose materials that are easy to modify based on student feedback, then you're in really good shape. All right. So again, going back to the best practices that were identified in the federal study, utilize multimodal, multisensory teaching methods. All right, and so again, this goes back to layering input, avoiding unsupported information, like something that's just strictly auditory. So you want to give students the opportunity to hear it, see it written, say it, see it, write it, sing it, write it, make a mnemonic for it, say it, act it out, read it, write it. And I feel like as language teachers, we're pretty good at this. But we just want to keep building in those layers. So I gave you the example here of just working with realia. In this case, it's food. So let's just say I were to pick up this little plastic chile from my basket. So we have the realia, we have me speaking the word, and then if there's also a way to build in the written of this word, for example, if I were just to write that word on an index card, then that gives students yet another way of processing the input. Number 6, actively employ learning and memory strategies. So here's one strategy that I use to work with memory and pronunciation, and that's building songs around different elements of the curriculum. So here's an example of one that I'll do early on. So this one is a little song, and it goes more or less like this. Hola, hola amigos, me llamo Eva, soy de los Estados Unidos. So you get the picture. And essentially I created this because students at the end of one semester could not pronounce Estados Unidos to save their lives. So I was like, all right, nor could they remember it. So 2 problems, the memory and the pronunciation. So You can also see that I've sort of given them this sort of fudgy language, and I only usually need to do this at the beginning of the semester, but mostly I just need to save some time. I'm not teaching decoding. Not that it isn't a fantastic idea, I just don't have the time in my particular curriculum. Okay, so again, you're seeing the music piece, and you're seeing some mnemonics. You see that, that little picture, and that's soy sauce. And so that, again, helps them trigger soy, which is a regular verb. This sort of continues. You have tango. I have a picture of two people doing the tango. I have about 1 million of these. You can't quite see it with the clip art, but the I went is a picture of a flea right next to that. So the mnemonic for that is fui. The $ is to help trigger enero for January. So I do a lot where I'm trying to support retrieval through these little memory devices. Arnold Schwarzenegger is there for hasta. So instead of, I don't really need hasta la vista bebé, but I might just need hasta miércoles. I also want things like accountability. And I do this often through oral assessments. My students come to me as masters of being able to kind of fudge it and get by. And I want them to get out of that habit. So I make things pretty clear. I tell them exactly what I expect from them. And I do all of my assessment both in writing and speaking. All right, so utilize instructional and assistive technologies. So naturally this fits right in with the graduate coursework because it's absolutely key for students with learning differences. Students with weaker language processing and memory abilities process language differently, and they benefit from getting information from multiple sensory pathways and multiple formats. They need ways where they can study more efficiently and have access to the sounds of the language out of class time. And this is becoming easier and easier with technology, where 20 years ago this was very difficult. Students benefit from the ability to self-pace, again, rapid feedback, opportunities to practice language, and then, of course, it helps teachers and students both to have tailor-made practice materials so that what students are seeing in the classroom is what they're practicing outside of class as well. The online practice materials that work best is materials that give students the ability to control how much material they're working with at any given time, that they can practice at their own speed, and of course in a way that's hands-on and fun. And again, it's important to hear and see the language simultaneously. I'm sharing with you here just a few of my favorite tech tools, and I use different ones at different times, of course, for different purposes. And some I like because they're easy for me as a creator of language practice materials. And other materials are just kind of short and very structured in and of themselves. So I'm sure many of these are very, very familiar to you. As Edwige mentioned, I wrote an article for FLT Mag early on, and what I thought was, you know, just very funny after that was more or less as soon as it was published, of course, you know, all of, you know, many of the formats of the programs that I talked about shifted slightly. Other ones went out of business entirely. So we're in a constant state of flux, but the magic of all of this is really that as teachers, we're able to create materials for our students that specifically match their needs. And you'll see a lot of materials that at one point were very, very expensive. So if we just take a look at speech to text. At one point, you know, the best tool for that was Dragon. Dragon Naturally Speaking, and you had to actually train the program to be able to recognize your voice. And some students will still need a very high-end product. But now you can even just in Word, you can, hit a dictate button and have the words magically appear on the page as you speak them. So things are becoming technology is becoming more and more available to teachers and students at low cost, which is exciting. All right, so number 7 in identified best practices was providing one-on-one support if possible. And every language teaching environment is different. And so, I would just say within this is whatever is possible, see if you can make that happen in as creative a way as possible, whether that's students helping students, or whether that's a learning center, whether it's involving people from the community, whether that's working with someone online. It makes a huge difference. And then of course create a supportive in-class environment was the final best practice identified, and it seems so obvious, but it's incredibly powerful. So I'm going to share with you some of my student voices. So at the end of every semester, I interview my students and collect some of their wisdom. So I'll share a few of the quotes, and here's one. Each student needs their own individual attention from the teacher. Get to know them so you can adapt to how they learn. Instead of teaching in a way for everyone to learn, try working with each student individually. Save the everyone part for when they need to put their skills to the test. These little quotes just talk about the benefit of multimodal instruction. And then the last one I'll read is, since not all learning differences come with the same strengths and weaknesses, I would suggest being in communication with the student about what is and isn't working for them in class. You can't be prepared for everything. And I don't know much about learning disabilities other than my own, so I would suggest setting the pace and style of learning to what you think is reasonable, but building in room for students to make slight modifications as they see necessary. Obviously, you can't change the course requirements, and the student eventually needs to do the work to pass the course, but little things like pacing and format of assignments can make a huge difference in how quickly and competently someone can pick up the material. All right, so in a different survey, I asked students, what advice would you give a foreign language teacher without much personal experience working with students with learning differences? The question was free response and with no prompts. And a full 30% of students spontaneously offered this advice, which I found amazing because each one of these students filling out my survey was in a different state in the United States, which was done online. And it was simply be patient and understanding. 30% of students said that. So if you're interested in additional resources, I have some articles that I wrote here. And what's exciting is that we have lots of material available to us at this time. When I first started teaching, there was very little, and now there's tremendous resources, and many of these books are absolutely wonderful. So I encourage you to keep exploring. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you very much. Okay, I have a few questions. Somebody's asking whether this presentation will be made available, and yes, I will share the slides and the recording. I will actually email all of that to you. I need a little bit of time to do a little bit of editing, but other than that, everybody will get the recording and the slides. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat room. I do have a couple questions. Eve, we talked about choosing a book for the Language Educator Book Club, and I read the first chapter of the one you have on your slide in the corner, Disability and Word Language Learning. Do you have another book that you would prefer to this one?
I think that one is very readable.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is it focuses on the universal design principles,
Okay.
and then overlays those principles on top of instruction, classroom instruction. And what I like about that is it's all very logical, but what I get slightly nervous about is that what's actually difficult about teaching world languages is it has to do with these very, very specific learning disabilities. Like you really have to understand phonological processing and auditory processing and executive functioning and all these very fine things that relate to memory. And that book doesn't go into that part super deeply. So it's easy to say, oh, give students a number of activities to choose from and then they'll be fine. And that is part of universal design of like keeping things high interest and giving students various ways to access information and different ways to show that they've learned what they've learned. But it's also easy to miss the mark for a teacher if without that deep understanding. So I personally tend to gravitate towards the Judith Cormos books, and those, if you take a look at the left-hand side of that visual, the two bottom ones are hers.
Okay.
And she goes really deeply into those disabilities. So it depends on your audience.
Do you know foreign languages for everyone? Somebody in the chat room says that she received it and that she likes it so far.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a half-friendly book.
Okay. Okay. I have another question about, you talked a lot about pacing. How do you manage pacing? If all of your students can learn at a different pace, how do you manage the ones that need a lot of time and to process the information versus the students who need a lot less time? How do you make sure they don't get bored? How do you manage that balance?
It's a really interesting question. And I think some of that I'm able to handle because I have relatively small classes.
Mm.
So, and also I take full advantage of the fact that I can put a lot of practice materials on my course management website. So I can sort of hold the center by saying like, okay, everyone is going to do, this one task. Like everybody takes the same final exam and the same, prep pieces as we go. But certain students do need more time. And then for the students that are ready to move on, I let them move on. And so I do have a course where people are doing slightly different things. So at some times we're doing things together, and at some times they're working independently, exactly where they are and working on what they need to learn.
Thank you. Henry asks, what do you think about the block periods versus the 45-minute periods time frame for the length of a language class?
I guess it depends on I think of it as how many times a week do I see them. So I'm thinking maybe the block, would he see that person less? Like, is that a bigger block means less contact throughout the week?
Yes, usually when they're on a block schedule, and that's at the high school level, they
Right.
see each other every other day.
I guess I'd like to see, in any given week, I want to see them on as many of those days as possible.
Yes, that makes sense, right?
That's my gut answer to that. And in part, that's so, for example, if a student misses one of those big blocks, it's very hard to catch them up again.
Yeah.
And part of it is I like to space the learning so that they can have a chunk of information, they can practice it outside of class, they have another chunk of information, and then have time for that information to settle. If I have big gaps in between when I see them, it's harder to keep the flow going. So if I had to choose, I would choose shorter blocks, but if I get to see that same student more times during that week.
Another very important comment from Margot. I don't know if you took classes with Margot, but she says you have a wonderful singing voice.
Oh, thank you.
And then Yumeli, she says, I have a better sense for what some of my students needs. How can you manage a class with mixed ability levels?
Um, I think it comes back to, I mean, I guess have a way of thinking about, um, and again, I think it's because I have small classes, but I have a clear sense of each student and where they are and where they need to go. And I also have a really clear sense of like, okay, this is the minimum of what I'm covering. This is the maple syrup of my class, right? So this is the minimum of what every student is going to get. And some students are going to get more than that. So I hold the bottom line really, really clearly. So every single person in that classroom, assuming they don't like get mono and disappear entirely,
Right.
every single person gets like this core foundation piece. And then on top of that, I find ways that other students can go farther. So it's just layering, you have, a practice set, and then it can be, you can have the minimum of that, or you can keep adding layers to it and making it more complex, so that you're moving it from, a novice high activity to an intermediate low activity, if that's where that student is.
Outside of having learning differences, there is a really good book on differentiation. It's an ACTFL book. It's differentiation in the word language classroom, I think.
Yeah.
Has a lot of really good strategies for creating activities that work at different levels.
Right, and that's essentially what we're talking about. And we're so much more able to do that now than we ever have been in the past, because we have access to all kinds of practice materials that either we design or we can scoop up off of the web and give students ways to practice those, create structures around those practice materials, even bringing in native speakers to the classroom, all kinds of things that we've never been able to do before.
There's another question. So somebody says differentiation is the biggest challenge we have as word language teachers, and it is definitely. I mean, I think differentiation can be challenging, especially when we have really large classes. There is another question from Christine, and she says, an accommodation widely recommended in my school for LD kids is for teachers to provide reference sheets based on students' needs. A reference sheet might have verb conjugations, phrases, vocab. Do you use this in your class?
So I believe the question is referring to sort of like the idea of having a word bank.
Yeah, for conjugation, phrases, vocab, like
I don't.
advanced organizers, I guess, a little bit.
An advanced organizer is kind of different. I think I don't use word banks because I really do focus on memory. So I focus very, very heavily on, yes, you're going to have to remember that word. And we build that in. But I'm also likely covering less material because I have the maple syrup approach. So if I had to cover a curriculum where I know students, like, there's just no way they're going to be able to have access in their brains to the material. But for the most part, I'm interested in retrieval versus recognition. If I give too many things like word banks and cheat sheets, we're kind of not necessary for certain students. They may not be getting very far.
Okay.
So I work very, very heavily on memory supports versus a cheat sheet, recognition, word bank kind of thing.
Okay. Christine, does that answer your question? Give Christine a chance to respond. Yes, thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. Like I said, this webinar will be emailed to everybody sometime tomorrow. It will be uploaded to the certificate YouTube channel. And this is where you can also find all the other webinars that we've given in the past, together with the slides. So thank you again. Okay, just one thing that came up in the chat right now from Martha. Reference sheets in my classroom are called chat mats. Oh yeah, I heard about chat mats. A sheet of paper with prompts, sentence starters, but often also pictures of vocabulary terms. For instance, when talking about what activities we like to do, students will create their own chat mats to use in conversation activities.
Oh, I love that idea. Yeah, that's more like an organizer kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like it. That's kind of what I had in mind. I chat mats. I'm gonna make a note of that because I've seen that pop up in several Facebook group. And then Marie Antonietta says, what I do is I provide word banks to my IEPs, but sometimes they tell me they don't want it. Also, it might be embarrassing sometimes when they say it aloud and other kids don't have a word bank. So yes, that's the whole piece of not wanting to stand out.
Yeah. So I would, yes, that's sort of the universal design concept of, you know, think of things that everybody can have access to that also help, you know, students on the high end and the low end.
And Martha says, love the maple syrup analogy, but maybe because I'm from New Hampshire. Thank you so much. This has been very interesting. Henry says, chat maps are great. Does anybody have an example of a chat mat to share in the chat room? Maybe a link. I don't want to leave my my full screen right now for the purpose of the recording, but if somebody has an example, I think, you know, I think Pinterest is probably a really good place for chat mats. Martha says, I use chat mats or graphic organizer all the time. Recently, Bethany Drew used the analogy of a city map. The first time you go to a new city, you don't memorize the map and leave it behind and then rely on your memory to find your way around. You pack the map to bring with you and refer to it as you explore. I like that a lot.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, especially me because I have no sense of direction. So at no point do I leave the map behind.
Yes, you never leave your map behind.
Yeah.
I like
Well,
it.
all of those things are absolutely wonderful. And what's also really important is that they bring a student's anxiety levels down.
Yes.
Because that's such a factor.
Because they have something, right?
Yeah, because they have something to jog their memory.
Very nice. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.